Okay, let's do this. Let's do tier 3 for the traditional Catholic iceberg, which I, Serp Kerp, have made. And you guys get to hear me with my beautiful voice and my beautiful stutter. First up, we got Reverend Novus Ordo, right here below the waterline. This is where traditional Catholicism starts. Reverend Novus Ordo. Novus Ordo is, of course, the new order of Mass, the 1969 liturgy following Vatican II. So Reverend Novus Ordo would be that liturgy which is done, which honors God, and which is done in line, similar to the way that the Mass was done prior to 1969 with the Latin Mass. So a lot more reverent. You're going to see things like the priest facing the tabernacle ad orientem. You're going to see communion on the tongue rather than on the hand. You're going to see altar boys rather than altar girls. You're not going to see the laity shaking each other's hands during the sign of peace. Overall, a Novus Ordo which matches the respect for the divine presence of Christ in the Eucharist like the Latin Mass would. Okay, next up we have the 1962 Missal. This is the last Missal of the Roman Rite that was published before Vatican II. It is the most commonly used Latin Mass Missal. It's used both by the Society of St. Pius X and in the Indult under both Summorum Pontificum and by the various Indult groups like the Fraternity of St. Peter. Next up, we have Pope Francis undermines evangelization. All the crises attached to Pope Francis, how he doesn't treat the Catholic Church and the Catholic faith very seriously, and in the eyes of many traditionalists and more over time, the general, you could say, small o Orthodox Catholics, he's seen as undermining the faith and serving as a disruption which causes Catholicism to be seen less seriously to Protestants, Orthodox, and non-Christians. Thus, it makes it really hard to try and evangelize to people and help to try and convert them to Catholicism when Francis is making the church into a laughingstock. Indult Mass. An indult, we're going to quote Wikipedia's page on indults here, is a thing in Catholic canon law, an indult or a permission or privilege granted to the competent church authority by the Holy See or the diocesan bishop, as the case may be, for an exception from a particular norm of church law in an individual case. A recent indult was granted in 1984 by John Paul II, and that was the beginning of the Latin Mass indult. That is where there is an exception to the norm, the modern Missal, the post-1969 Missal, the Novus Ordo, where prior Missals are allowed, those prior Missals being the Latin Mass. So basically, indult Masses are Masses that are allowed under the structures of the normal Catholic Church. These are Latin Masses permitted by the local bishop under priests that are under the local bishop in full communion with the local bishop and thus the Holy See. Next up we have Charles Coulomb. Charles Coulomb is a Catholic writer. He often talks about history as a background in history, and he's a traditionalist author. He is very good because he is very soft-spoken, but he also talks about controversial issues, so he is a really good place to introduce, say, more normie Catholics to the world of traditional Catholicism and its worldview. Charles Coulomb is also a monarchist, and so he talks about monarchism a lot in his books. He publishes under Tumblr House, or most of his books are published under Tumblr House, and so he has a semi-regular appearance on the Tumblr House YouTube channel where he goes over various topics just within the church and within the culture at large. Next up we have Father Malachi Martin. Now Father Malachi Martin, he's a pretty controversial figure to say the least. He became an author after Vatican II, and he talked about many traditionalist topics and topics which are interesting to the Catholic world at large, but also supernatural topics. His most famous book was 1976's Hostage to the Devil, which was about exorcisms. He He made a lot of appearances on Coast to Coast AM with Art Bell at the time, which was one of the most infamous and interesting shows in the history of American radio, in the history of UFOs and supernatural activity. And so he would go on to Coast AM a lot, and that's where he got a lot of coverage. He wrote a lot of these strange kind of novels that are supposed to be conspiracy books that are, you know, sort of true or almost true. There's a lot of controversy surrounding him as a person, and there's allegations that he was a homosexual and or that he lived with a woman, and just a lot of odd allegations, in him saying that he saw like demons attack him in person, manifesting into the flesh and attacking him. Just a lot of controversy that's attached to his person. He was actually a professor of paleography, and he wrote several books about the Dead Sea Scrolls before the council. But after the council, he was a Jesuit, and he, for the most part, left the Jesuit order. He didn't completely leave it. It's kind of odd, but he had most of his vows taken away. He didn't serve as a priest day to day or in a parish, but he was never defrocked or anything like that. He just lived as a priest and then wrote all these books. Next up, we have Michael Voris. Now, Michael Voris, again, super controversial speaker. Probably not as traditionalist as a lot more people will go down through this iceberg with, but Voris, he used to be president of St. Michael's Media. He was leader of Church Militant, which is a kind of like online TV version of EWTN, or like an online televangelist network for Catholics, which isn't run by the Catholic Church or clergy, which is run by lay people, including Michael Voris. Michael Voris recently stepped down. Michael Voris had a long history of homosexual inclinations, and he stepped down due to scandal concerning that. Michael Voris, though, was really famous because of how aggressive he would attack priests and bishops throughout the church, and he would just kind of like attack them in interviews, and just kind of like go after bishops, not really talk about the theology or try to promote, say, maybe a more orthodox or even traditionalist theology. He would just be very aggressive and just list off these bad things that bishops do or are supposed to have done in some of these cases. And so he was super combative, and he burned a lot of bridges, and he made a lot of enemies. And so what ended up happening is that he got put on a lot of like Southern Poverty Center hate lists and stuff like that, and ended up getting sued by a lot of dioceses for slander. He's resigned from Church Militant now, and it's unclear what the future of for Church Militant what is going to be. Okay, and next up we have Summorum Pontificum. Summorum Pontificum is an apostolic letter published by Pope Benedict XVI in July of 2007. And this broadened the indult for the Latin Mass massively. And this was the 1962 Mass, which we talked about earlier, of that version of the Latin Mass. And it called the Novus Ordo the ordinary form. It made the Latin Mass into the extraordinary form, and basically allowed any diocesan priest to do it if their congregation wanted it, and to do it privately whenever they wanted. And so it led to a massive explosion in the celebration of the Latin Mass, and it led to a lot of lay people, especially Gen Xers and millennials and Zoomers, going to the Latin Mass for the first time, and just kind of spread traditionalism and throughout the church as just kind of this fertilizer. And of course, Pope Francis clamped down on it and revoked it recently in 2021 with Traditionalist Custodes. Okay, now we have Tan Books. Tan Books has been a long-time Catholic distributor and publisher of books. They're kind of seen as a more traditionalist publisher. And they've been around since 1967. They've gone through a lot of different owners. They're currently owned by St. Benedict Press. They publish a lot of good stuff. At earlier times, some of the stuff was a little bit edgier than it is today. So if you ever go to a used bookstore, you're going to see a lot of tan books generally within the Catholic section of a used bookstore. Next, we have NFP, which is short for Natural Family Planning. Natural Family Planning is family planning methods which are approved by the Catholic Church. Those are planning methods to either help you get pregnant or to avoid pregnancy, which do not use artificial contraception. And you try to track the woman's cycle and see when she's fertile, and you either avoid sex during the fertility window or you have sex during the fertility window to have children. It wouldn't be sinful in the minds of most Catholics because you're open to having a child if it doesn't work out, and you're not blocking or preventing pregnancy in any real way. Next up, we have not eating meat on every Friday. Now, most Catholics in the United States, or I would say the Western world that are real, weekly church followers, probably only avoid eating meat on Fridays during Lent. But from my understanding, that's technically not what you're supposed to be doing. You should technically be not eating meat every Friday. And so a lot of people that are more tradition-minded, they will be avoiding eating meat every Friday. Next up on our iceberg, we have Eastern Catholic churches or Eastern Rite churches. So there are 23 Eastern Christian particular churches of the Catholic Church which are in full communion with the Pope. So the reality is that the Pope is the Patriarch of the West, but there are several other churches in communion with what you could call the Roman Catholic Church, and each of these would be Eastern Catholic churches. And so there's something like 18 or 20 million Eastern Catholic churches within various rites, and these rites celebrate the same liturgy that is seen within Eastern Orthodoxy and Oriental Orthodoxy. A lot of traditionalists who would have grown up in the Novus Ordo, they don't want to go to the Novus Ordo. They end up going to Eastern Rite Catholic churches because the liturgy in those churches has not been touched by the reforms of Vatican II, and so in their eyes, they're a lot more reverent than the liturgy that occurs in most of the churches within the Western Rite right now. Okay, now we have Francis is not a good pope. Probably should have put this in quotes because this is a statement or an opinion, but this is just the observation that Francis's papacy has had numerous scandals, theologically, and morally, and even structurally just with his very conduct. And so with all these scandals, as I said before, with Francis's undermining evangelization, these scandals are undermining the credibility of the Catholic Church, and they're causing people to leave the Catholic Church or have a crisis of faith where they think that the Church is not the true Church of Christ because what Francis is doing seems to be a discontinuity. Next up, speaking of continuity, we have the hermeneutic of continuity. And now this was a term that was used by Benedict XVI when he was Pope, and when he was Cardinal and Prefect, I'm going to mispronounce everything, stutter boy here, Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. And so the hermeneutic of continuity is kind of a way to read everything that comes out of Vatican II, everything that comes after Vatican II in continuity with everything that came before Vatican II, stressing that the Catholic Church is the same church and it's teaching the same things before and after the Council. And this is in strong contrast to the idea of the spirit of Vatican II, where there's this generalizing liberal tendency to kind of drop everything that is Catholic and just liberalize the church. And of course, Benedict XVI had a term, his own term, for that kind of attitude, and that's the hermeneutic of rupture, that Vatican II is a rupture with everything, and this is a new church, right? And so next up after that hermeneutic of continuity, we have FSSP, or the Priestly Fraternity of St. Peter. And so that's a traditionalist Catholic Society of Apostolic Life, where it's a society of priests, and they are traditionalist priests that are in full communion with the Catholic Church, the normal Catholic Church, I should say, or they're regular with the Catholic Church, and they offer the 1962 Missal, the Latin Mass. And so the Fraternity of St. Peter, they were really created after the Society of St. Pius X was excommunicated following the 1988 Icone consecrations. The Fraternity of St. Peter is a pretty vibrant priestly order with a lot of seminarians and a lot of priests that are rapidly being ordained. It is a pretty good society which offers the Latin Mass and is loyal to the bishops. Okay, next up we have Bishop Strickland. Now, Bishop Strickland, this only came up, the controversy surrounding him only came up in the middle of writing this iceberg. And so he used to be the Bishop of Tyler, Texas, until, I believe, in October or November, Pope Francis, that is, forcibly removed him from his diocese. And that's because Bishop Strickland was starting to become a pretty prominent opponent of Francis and would criticize him publicly. And so he called Francis something like this, an expert of producing cowards. Francis pushed aside the true pope and attempted to sit on a chair that's not his, and he's a usurper of St. Peter's chair. He proclaims the devil's voice to be the voice of the Holy Spirit. So Francis wouldn't take this open criticism and, forcibly pushed him out of office. And Bishop Strickland wasn't a open traditionalist for very long. He only first began celebrating the Latin Mass in 2020 before he was forcibly dismissed from his diocese in 2023. So he kind of flared up really fast and got kicked out really fast, and it's very rare for a bishop to, because Francis asked him to resign and he refused, and Francis actually used his power as pope to forcibly resign him from the diocese. Strickland didn't go off and try to run his counter diocese yet, as far as I know. Okay, next we have air quotes, or I don't know if air quotes, but quotation, more Catholic than the Pope. And this is, of course, a slander which is commonly used against traditionalists and just faithful Catholics in general, because they will take the faith seriously, or at least more seriously than the Pope in a lot of people's eyes. And so it was kind of a slander to say under John Paul II or Benedict XVI, and now traditionalists will just say, I'm more Catholic than the Pope openly. Just kind of a sad state of affairs where everything's at right now. Next up, we have the Anglican Ordinariate, or a personal ordinariate for former Anglicans. This is an ordinariate or canonical structure within the Catholic Church which was created to enable groups of Anglicans to join the Catholic Church but preserve parts of their liturgy and parts of, I guess the word is spiritual patrimony. So they're allowed to use the Anglican, I guess I'll just call it the Anglican Mass, but fixed a little bit to be more in line with Catholic doctrine, and to use the Book of Common Prayer and even the King James Bible, just fixed a little bit to be in line with Catholic doctrine. And so this was created in 2009 under Pope Benedict, as the Anglican Church globally has gone through a great crisis of liberalism. And so a lot of Anglican priests and bishops, who if they weren't married, they had to step down from bishops and just become priests, to celebrate Mass in a way which is more like that of the Anglican use. And the irony is that they're joining the Catholic Church with the Novus Ordo in wide use. So the average Anglican ordinate church has a much higher liturgy, a much more reverent liturgy than that used in most Catholic churches. So it's just kind of ironic. So a lot of traditionalists, if they're unable to go to a Latin Mass, or at least a Latin Mass, which would be an indult and regular or legal for them, licit to go for them to go to as lay people, they will go to Anglican ordinate churches. The Anglican ordinate's kind of weird though, because we talked about Eastern Catholics before. It's this weird kind of in between where it's like almost becoming like a rite of the Catholic Church. Like the Anglicans are coming back and we're coming back in communion, so they'll have their own stuff, but as long as they're loyal to the Pope and as long as they're Orthodox, they can do their Mass like the Eastern Rite does, but they're not fully given the status of an Eastern Church like the Byzantine Catholics are. So it's just kind of this weird thing, and it's just kind of in this limbo, and it's yet to be seen if in the future, if there's going to end up being another Western Rite church within the Catholic Church, an Anglican Catholic Church, if you will. Next up, we have Mel Gibson. Mel Gibson is, of course, a famous American actor and American director. He grew up as a traditionalist Catholic, and he still identifies that today. He made probably the most famous Christian movie ever, just in total of all Christian films, I would say. Passion of the Christ, which was, of course, deeply influenced by the Catholic faith and various devotionals about Christ's crucifixion and his passion, and visions of Christ's crucifixion and his passion. And it is just kind of seen as the piece of art which is made since Vatican II, which best exemplifies the traditional Catholic worldview. Next up, we have the Baltimore Catechism. The Baltimore Catechism has now fallen into public domain, so you can find it online. But this was the national catechism used by the Catholic Church in the United States for education of children and adults from something like 1885 till the late 1960s, early 1970s. And so a lot of traditional Catholics will keep using this catechism and point to it as a much better catechism than the John Paul II Catechism, or simply called the Catechism of the Catholic Church. And so while the mainstream Catholic Church, for the most part in the United States, uses the Catechism of the Catholic Church, or actually the United States Catholic Catechism for Adults, which is based off the Catechism of the Catholic Church, a lot of traditionalists and just faithful Catholics in general prefer the Baltimore Catechism, because the Baltimore Catechism is very clear, and it's short and it's sweet, and it's very orthodox. So if you use the Catechism of the Catholic Church or the John Paul II Catechism, it has very long, verbose explanations where a person that's not very well read on theology is going to get lost. While the Baltimore Catechism, each one, there's Baltimore Catechism 1 for younger children, Baltimore Catechism 2 for like middle schoolers, Baltimore Catechism 3 for adults, and Baltimore Catechism 4 for catechism teachers. It's a lot simpler and just directly will tell you theology or doctrine. Okay, next up we have Reform of the Reform. This is the movement which is trying to take the Novus Ordo and make it more reverent. We talked about the reverent Novus Ordo, and make it try and match the Latin Mass. And so this was kind of a movement of people that viewed the Novus Ordo as this disruption that's undermining Catholic faith, and it's undermining belief in the real presence. And so we don't want to I guess a lot of people that were pushing Reform of the Reform probably would go to the Latin Mass if it was available, but a lot of people, there wasn't the indult, they didn't have that available, so they were just trying to reform the Novus Ordo to make it more in line with the real presence, belief in the real presence, and that there wouldn't be liturgical abuse. Ultimately, it seems that the movement just has been swallowed up by traditionalism as traditionalism has grown in strength. Next, we have Bishop Athanasius Snyder. He is a, what would you call it? A Volga or Black Sea German. So it's an ethnic German settler who moved into the Russian Empire and then the Soviet Union, who is a bishop in Kazakhstan. You see, after World War II, there were ethnic Germans that were in the Soviet Union, and Stalin punished them because he believed that they were loyal to the Nazis in World War II by forcibly deporting them into Kazakhstan. And so there is a community of Catholics in that very large but arguably pretty obscure and population-wise small nation. And Athanasius Snyder is a bishop there. His priest growing up is actually a blessed. Oh, I'm going to say his name wrong. Oleski Zarikli, and he was a Ukrainian priest who was martyred in 1963, and that was one of the priests that catechized him. And so he ended up moving to East Germany and then West Germany with his family in the 1970s. He would end up becoming ordained and consecrated and became a bishop there in Kazakhstan. Since then, since I guess really Francis's papacy, he's kind of become the most open bishop that has a diocese or is regular with the church in promoting traditional Catholicism, and then over time directly criticizing Pope Francis. His criticisms have been nowhere near as sharp as Bishop Strickland's, so he has not been kicked out of his diocese yet. I feel like something like that could happen before this iceberg videos are even finished getting made. But just a pretty interesting figure. He also will do things like speak out against mass immigration from the third world into Europe of Muslims. He recently published his own catechism, which is interesting. I believe it's called Credo. Next, we have organ music at Mass. So in the first tier, we had guitar Mass. Second tier, we have piano Mass. And now getting down to a more reverent liturgy, we have the organ Mass. Organs were used a lot more commonly prior to Vatican II than guitars and even pianos, right? So in the minds of a lot of traditionalists, if you're going to have accompaniment, musical accompaniment that is by an instrument at Mass, it ought to be an organ. Then we have communion on the tongue, right? Communion on the tongue is how the Eucharist was traditionally received prior to the reforms of the Second Vatican Council in the liturgy. And so most traditionalists believe you ought to receive communion on the tongue, and it's extremely important. And the reason for that is if you receive communion on the hand, it's a lot more likely for parts of the host to break off, and the host, the entire thing, is the body and blood of our Lord through transubstantiation. So if any piece of it were to fall off when it's placed in the hand, it could fall on the floor and be stepped on and desecrated by people. So a lot of traditionalists think that the way that the Eucharist is received by most lay people throughout the world is a liturgical abuse. Next up, we have Gregorian chant. Gregorian chant is a chant which is, deeply entrenched within the history of the Catholic Church. It's usually done in Latin, and it's done without any musical accompaniment. People chanting slowly in Latin all at the same time. A lot of people find it very calming, and it helps them center on meditation during Mass. You need a lot of men to do it. It's traditionally done by men or boys. So it wasn't like before Vatican II, it would have been in every chapel in the countryside. It usually would have been, say, at higher Masses or pontifical Masses, and usually probably a cathedral or a bigger, more important church. But, of course, this fell away after Vatican II, and now it's kind of rarely seen. Sadly, I think most people are more familiar with Gregorian chants, not from the church, but from the theme song for the video game Halo. And there's, of course, the infamous meme that, how do you know which church is the true church, the Protestant church or the Catholic church? Well, obviously it's the Catholic Church, because Protestant music sucks because it sounds like Coldplay, and Catholic music is awesome because it sounds like Halo. Next up, we have Michael Lofton. Michael Lofton is a theologian and apologist who's had a very interesting background. So he has been Jewish and Presbyterian and Baptist, Catholic, then Orthodox, then Catholic again. And recently he has his channel called Reason and Theology, and he originally started out as actually pretty hard traditionalist and now has become the poster child for the Pope-splainers. And we'll get to Pope-splaining further along here. But he's an apologist, and what he ends up doing, though, during his Pope-splaining or his lengthy defenses of Pope Francis, is he attacks not just traditionalists as his opponents in what might not be seen as the most charitable fashion, but just plain small o Orthodox Catholics across the board. And so he's burned a lot of bridges and made a lot of enemies with his style. But as they say, loft dog is top dog. And as Michael Lofton himself says, Pope Francis is the Vatican glue. Now we have LifeSite News. LifeSite News is a Canadian conservative, Catholic, anti-abortion website. It's just kind of a news website. The problem is that LifeSite News posts a lot of news which I don't consider to be the most valid, or at least their headlines are written to not be the most valid, and it kind of ends up being yellow journalism in my opinion. And I feel like LifeSite's news basically kind of like black pills a lot of Catholics that tell them that the Catholic Church is about to explode at any second, and it's just kind of like, for lack of a better term, fear porn, and it kind of sells itself through clickbait in trying to get Catholics to look at it and think that the Catholic Church is about to defect at any second. And so I think it's not very reliable, and it can be pretty toxic. Next up, I have a Bible quotation here, a pretty important Bible quotation, 1 Corinthians 11, 2 through 16, and I'm going to read it out of the Douay-Rheims. Now I praise you, brethren, that in all things you are mindful of me, and keep my ordinances as I have delivered them to you. But I would have you know that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of the woman is the man, and the head of Christ is God. Every man praying or prophesying with head covered disgraceth his head. But every woman praying or prophesying with her head not covered disgrace her head. For it is all one as if she were shaven. For if a woman be not covered, let her be shorn. But if it be a shame to a woman to be shorn or made bald, let her cover her head. The man indeed ought not to cover his head, because he is the image and glory of God, but the woman is the glory of the man. For the man is not of the woman, but the woman of the man. For the man is not created for the woman, but the woman for the man. Therefore ought the woman to have power over her head, because of the angels. But yet neither is the man without the woman, nor the woman without the man in the Lord. For as the woman is of the man, so also is the man by the woman, but all things of God. You yourselves judge, doth it become a woman to pray unto God uncovered? Doth not even nature itself teach you, that a man indeed, if he nourish his hair, it is a shame unto him? But a woman nourish her hair, it is a glory to her, for her hair is given to her for a covering. But if any man seem to be contentious, we have no such custom, nor the church of God. So this is just saying that, well, there's more here, but it's primarily saying that men don't wear hats in church, something which is done pretty much by all men in all churches throughout Christianity. But it's also saying that women need to have head coverings in church. And so it's advocating that women wear hats, or what they traditionally wore, veils in church to cover their hair, because that's what they need to do to be modest. Of course, in the Western world and throughout a lot of Christianity in general, head covering for women has declined. A lot of traditionalists women still wear veils. The other thing that this Bible quote is saying is that the man is the head of the household. Next up, we got Pachamama. Pachamama is probably one of the worst scandals in the entirety of Pope Francis's papacy. So Pachamama is actually a pagan god of the Amazon and in the Incan Empire religion. It's a fertility goddess in Incan mythology, kind of like an earth mother. And so during the Amazon Synod, Pope Francis allowed the worship of an idol to this pagan god, Pachamama, to be done in Catholic churches and Catholic worship spaces. And so it was a grievous scandal, and the Pachamamas ended up being stolen, I think, maybe even twice, dumped into the Tiber. It was a big deal. Just terrible, allowing an idol to be placed within an area of Christian worship. Truly one of the most scandalous things that's happened in its papacy. Next up, we have extra ecclesiam nulla salus, a Latin phrase meaning outside the church there is no salvation. And so this is the doctrine held by the Catholic Church, that you cannot be saved if you're not a Catholic. You can only be saved by the Catholic faith and if you are a member of the Catholic Church. If you are a member of a schismatic church, so an Eastern Orthodox, or a member of a heretical church, Eastern Orthodox also have heresies, and Protestants are also schismatics, so say something like the Protestants, you are outside of the body of the church, and though you may worship Jesus and you may be validly baptized, you cannot be saved by Protestantism and Eastern Orthodoxy. You can only be saved by the true Church of Jesus Christ and the true religion, the Catholic Church. And this has been defined numerous times, and it is probably the most controversial teaching of the Catholic Church, which a lot of prelates are very fearful and do not want to preach. And so it is a very feared saying that a lot of bishops and priests will not say out loud. And so another thing, I talked about ecumenism earlier, a lot of traditionalists would say that ecumenism undermines, perhaps even grievously, the teaching of extra ecclesiam nulla salus. Okay, next up we have the Douay-Rheims Bible. The Douay-Rheims Bible is, of course, an English translation which was published beginning in 1582. I think the entire Bible was finally published in 1610. It is the traditional English Catholic translation. This was the Bible used by Catholics basically for the greater part of 350 years. And this Bible, unlike the King James Version or the Geneva Bible, which were its main competitors, was not translated from Greek and Hebrew or Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic. It was translated directly from the Latin Vulgate, that is, the Latin translation translated and compiled by St. Jerome, which for the most part, until 1943, was basically the official, infallible Bible of the Catholic Church following Trent. And so a lot of Protestants and a lot of modern scriptural scholars will turn up their noses on the Douay-Rheims because it wasn't translated directly from the Greek and directly from the Hebrew. Of course, the scholars were looking over the Textus Receptus at the time, the Greek text, and they would have known about the Hebrew text. They would have known about the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Old Testament, when they were translating it, and they would have kept that in mind. And in fact, ironically, the Douay-Rheims is a lot closer to the Hebrew and Greek than most modern translations because it's fairly literal. So a lot like the NAV, which is based off of, you know, the most up to date and best Greek, it's a lot more distant than the original tongue than the Douay-Rheims is. The Douay-Rheims also doesn't water down doctrine in an ecumenical way like the NAB or the RSV, the Revised Standard Version, even the Catholic edition does. So I've been reading it in all the Bible translations here. A lot of people don't like the Douay-Rheims. I mean, even in comparison to the King James Version, because it's just, they think that it's just clunky because of how literal it is. But, you know, I like it. A lot of people like it. Technically, the Douay-Rheims that most Catholics use isn't actually the original Douay-Rheims, and it has a lot of revisions in it. So it's technically the Douay-Rheims Challoner version, named after the head of the Catholic Church in the 1750s in England. And so that's the revision that most people use. I think for a long period after the New American Bible came out and after Revised Standard Version and the Jerusalem Bible and all that stuff came out, the Douay-Rheims kind of fell into a decline. But I think now with the whole King James only movement, kind of like within Protestantism, and Catholics looking over and seeing that and looking their criticisms of higher criticism and how that's undermined a lot of translations, they're turning back to the Douay-Rheims. And it seems every year more and more people are using the Douay-Rheims, and it's just kind of spreading throughout Catholicism, both within the traditionalist movement and, as I would say, just the general small o Orthodox Catholics. Okay, next up we have the Dubia. Now the Dubia was a document, a list of questions which were sent to Pope Francis as a way to try and clarify the controversies connected to Amoris Laetitia. It was published by some pretty well-esteemed, high-ranking cardinals, these 5 cardinals, including Cardinal Brandmüller and Cardinal Berg. It seems, I would say, Francis replied to it to somewhat, but he's never fully replied to it and clarified the whole controversy concerning civilly divorced and remarried Catholics being allowed to receive communion. And so it just kind of stands out as this controversy which Francis has not addressed, and he's been told to address by you know, the people which are the most able to force him to address it. Next up, we have a very strong controversy and a very big conspiracy, and that is the third secret of Fatima. Fatima was an apparition that took place in Fatima, Portugal in 1917 in a series of visions, and there were three secrets which were part of those visions given to the seer children. Fatima, by the way, is probably the greatest public miracle in recorded history. A lot of the miracles in the Old Testament technically aren't recorded history because recorded history kind of starts with kind of like the Greek Golden Age and the Roman Empire. That's where we get to recorded history. So the miracles are technically of the Bible are Bronze Age and Iron Age, but even compared to the crossing of the Red Sea, the miracle of the sun, where you have tens of thousands, maybe over 100,000 people seeing the sun do a little dance in the sky. It was a pretty dramatic miracle. And so Fatima and the message of Fatima to pray the rosary, that is key to the heart of a lot of Orthodox, small o Orthodox Catholics, but also traditional Catholics throughout the world. So Sister Lucia of the Seer Children was the longest surviving one, and she wrote down the 3 secrets. And the first secret was released, and the second secret, which predicted World War II, was released and called for the consecration of Russia. And that's a controversy in and of itself, if the Pope has ever actually correctly consecrated Russia. And so all these popes have tried to consecrate Russia and the world, or consecrate Russia and Ukraine. And is it done in accordance with the way that Mary did it? And so there's all this stuff. Is it been consecrated? Has it been sort of consecrated? And so that's a controversy in and of to itself. But the biggest controversy concerning Fatima is that Sister Lucia said that the third secret of Fatima ought to be released around 1960. And she said it needs to be released because it will appear clearer at that time. And John the 23rd refused to release it at that time. He was Pope. The way that I think even Archbishop Lefebvre said this, or he was outside the room when it was revealed to John the 23rd. He said, like, John the 23rd was extremely dismissive of it and said, this is irrelevant to my pontificate. And because of that, it wasn't, the version, I should say, of the third secret was released was only in 2000. And it's pretty obscure. I can read an English translation here. The third part of the secret revealed at Cova di Ira Fatima on the 13th of July 1917. I will write in obedience to you, my God, who command me to do so through His Excellency the Bishop of Leiria, and through your most holy mother and mine, after two parts which I have already explained. At the left of Our Lady and a little above, we saw an angel with a flaming sword in his left hand. Flashing, it gave out flames and looked as though they would set the world on fire, but they died out in contact with the splendor that Our Lady radiated towards him from her right hand. Pointing to the earth with his right hand, the angel cried out in a loud voice, "Penance, penance, penance," and we saw an immense light that God, something similar to how people appear in a mirror when they pass in front of it. A bishop dressed in white. We had the impression that it was the Holy Father, other bishops, priests, men and women, religious, going up to a steep mountain, and at the top of which there was a big cross of rough-hewn trunks as of a cork tree with a bark. Before reaching there, the Holy Father passed through a big city, half in ruins and half trembling, with halting steep. Afflicted with pain and sorrow, he prayed for the souls of the corpses he met along the way. Having reached the top of the mountain on his knees at the foot of the big cross, he was killed by a group of soldiers who fired bullets and arrows at him. And in the same way, there died one after another the other bishops, priests, men, and other women, religious women, and various lay people of the different ranks and positions. Beneath the two arms of the cross, there were two angels, each with a crystal astorium in his hand, in which they gathered the blood of the martyrs, and with it sprinkled the souls that were making their way to God. Okay, so pretty obscure. It seems to talk about a martyrdom of a lot of religious, including a pope. So I think the Vatican, or a lot of people kind of more regular with the church as opposed to lay people criticizing the church, or maybe dissidents in the traditionalist movement, interpret it to be the assassination of John Paul II. Some people think that it's either heavily edited or it's just an outright forgery, and that the third secret has been covered up to this day, because it was said that this needs to be not released until 1960. It was believed that this was a direct warning by some traditionalists about Vatican II and the consequences of the council for the church. Next we have most people go to hell. So if you looked up in the higher tiers, we had reasonable hope that all may be saved, and we had everyone goes to heaven. Now, most people go to hell. That's the more theologically correct, more common teaching you're going to get. It's from the saints, from theologians throughout the history of the church. And it makes sense, because you can't be saved unless you're in a state of sanctifying grace. That means you have not committed a mortal sin, and because there's no salvation outside of the church, only Catholics can be saved. So even if every single Catholic were saved, that would still be a minority of humanity, because there's only, it's always a billion or so, right? But there's 8 billion people in the world, and if every single Catholic was fully in a state of sanctifying grace, that would be only 1 in 8 human beings. That would mean most people go to hell. And as we talked about earlier, Most people that are baptized Catholic, they don't go to Mass every Sunday. They aren't regularly going to communion. They're doing mortal sins and they're not being forgiven of them. So, it would make sense that the vast majority of people would ultimately be damned. And there are numerous Bible quotes, both from St. Paul and directly in the Gospels from our Lord, saying that there will be many which will be damned. Okay, now we have the church has fallen into decline since Vatican II. This is, I don't think it's really debatable that since the 1960s and the 1970s, that the Catholic Church on numerous indicators has substantially declined in terms of adherence, in terms of church attendance, in terms of ordinations, in terms of catechesis of the laity. Across the board, there's just been a general malaise which has taken over the church and pushed it into what could be seen as a stark decline in the piety of both the laity and the clergy. At the same time, a lot of laity and clergy have been picking up heresies, and the church hierarchy has not acted to try and clarify, in many cases, these heresies, or if they do clarify them, they don't try to prevent them or have people drop the heresies. They kind of just say it's wrong and then move on. There's been an apostasy of many people leaving the church. The church is just generally seen as weaker and less capable and charismatic and proving its extraordinary claims as the one true ark of salvation for the human race. Next up, we have young earth creationism. Young earth creationism is, of course, the belief that God directly created the world as it is described in a very literal fashion at the beginning of the book of Genesis. Young earth creationists believe that the earth is 6,000 to 10,000 years old, depending on which version of the Old Testament they have, the Septuagint if they're using it, or if they're using the Masoretic Hebrew text. While pious Catholics probably are the group of Christians that are most accepting of evolution or an old earth compared to, say, pious Eastern Orthodox or pious Protestant fundamentalists, there is a contingency of young earth creationists within the Catholic Church, and they do trend on average to be more towards a traditionalist bent. Next we have Pope Francis flip-flops, and that's just something that seems to be across the board. He does not give straight answers. He flip-flops. He tells one group of people what they want to hear, another group of people what they want to hear. He tells small O Orthodox, or so you could say faithful Catholics, faithful theologically correct things, and then he tells vague things that liberals want to hear what they want to hear. And so a lot of the controversies which surround his papacy, the Amoris Laetitia controversy, I'm going to mispronounce it, the whole blessing the gays controversy, those come up from this kind of flip-floppy attitude that he has. Next up, we have Institute of Christ, the King, Sovereign Priest. This is a society of apostolic life of pontifical right, which is in full communion to the Holy See, and which does the traditional Latin Mass liturgy. While not as big as the Fraternity of St. Peter, it is definitely a pretty big group of priests which offer the traditional Mass that are in full communion with the Holy See, and they are growing. Next up, we have the Pope Francis death penalty controversy. And this is something I feel that gets kind of glanced over and doesn't get put into the level of direness or scandal that the whole Amoris Laetitia or the blessing of gays recently has kicked up, that dirt that those have kicked up. But Pope Francis modified the Catechism of the Catholic Church, again what I call the John Paul II Catechism, to say that the death penalty or capital punishment is inadmissible in light of the gospel, and in, I'm going to mispronounce it here, Fratelli Tutti, which is his encyclical in 2020, he also says that the death penalty is inadmissible and that there is no stepping back from this position, which is in extreme contradiction to the historical teachings of the church. The Bible directly gives the death penalty as a punishment numerous times for crimes in Leviticus, in Numbers, in Exodus, throughout the Torah or Pentateuch. God absolutely approves of the use of capital punishment biblically, and that the church has routinely said that capital punishment is admissible. Now, John Paul II kind of moved into this direction, and a lot of more liberal and more middle of the road bishops tried to tack on opposition to the death penalty to the pro-life position. But the Papal States executed numerous people. It's absurd to say otherwise. It is very, very clear that throughout the history of the Catholic Church has supported the death penalty or capital punishment. And this is a grievous controversy, which I feel is just kind of being swept under the rug. Next up, we have a pretty big scandal, pretty big controversy going back to the whole sex abuse crisis, or the sex abuse scandal we talked about before. We have the John Jay Report, or the nature and scope of the problem of sexual abuse of minors by Catholic priests and deacons within the United States. And that was done as a 2004 report by the John Jay College of Criminal Justice on behalf of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, done by surveys completed by the diocese within the United States. And this is the statistical backswing to the whole sex abuse scandal or sex abuse crisis. If you look into it, pretty negative, sad numbers. It says that about 4% of all ordained clergy from 1950 to 2002 were accused of sexual abuse. Now, keep in mind, I want to say this, though. A lot of priests that are accused of sexual abuse are dead and can't defend themselves. And that the United States has a long history of after-the-fact accusations of sexual abuse. This is most well-known with the Satanic Panic of the 1980s, where numerous people were accused of satanic ritual abuse and nothing came of it. And so, in my mind, as a historian, I know that sexual abuse definitely occurred, and that in the John Jay Report there is a lot of data that points to the reality of that, and that there clearly were victims. But I do also see that there seems to be a lot of similarities with these accusations of sexual abuse by Catholic clergy and with the satanic ritual abuse. Now, of course, the mainstream media will not see that connection, and they will say that the Satanic Panic, if you will, and the ritual abuse that occurred there had no validity, while all the sexual abuse that would have occurred within the Catholic Church to children and minors absolutely covered up, absolutely valid every single case. And again, I know if you're a victim, that may sound like I'm doubting the validity of your story. I'm not. But this is just something I have to get it out of the way. In the John Jay Report, it says 0.1% of clergy were convicted, or 5.7% of those accused. Now, I know that it is very difficult, if it does occur, any kind of sexual abuse is very difficult to prove, and it is very rare as well that somebody will be convicted. But once you look into the data of the John Jay Report, some striking things happen. The number of alleged abuses increased in the 1960s, peaked in the 1970s, started to decline throughout the 80s, and by the 1990s had returned to the levels of the 1950s. Which means that the spike and the decline mirror the implementation of Vatican II, which is kind of interesting. And if you look into the nature of the abuse, the profile is that it was largely teenage or pubescent boys. And so that it is male on male sexual abuse. Of course, there were children that were prepubescent girls that were abused, but the majority of abuse occurred to pubescent and teenage boys. And this matches a common form of sexual abuse that occurs within the gay community, which is known as pederasty. This type of abuse is ubiquitous between all homosexual groups, male homosexual groups, that is, throughout the globe. It is a very common thing. Now, of course, I'm not saying that every single man that is afflicted with homosexual desire is a pederast, but there is a strong history of pederasty within every homosexual subculture throughout humanity. Before I move on, it is also worth noting that the John Jay report, that its writing does not match its data. It does not ever talk about the homosexual inclination and the homosexual data registered within the nature of the data. It whitewashes its own data. It does, what is so common within a lot of scientific papers. It supports the status quo ideology, even if the data aggressively disagrees with what the status quo says. Moving on, now we're going to talk about Archbishop Vigano. Archbishop Vigano is an Italian archbishop. He was Apostolic Nuncio to the United States from 2011 to 2016. And he served as Secretary General of the Government of the Vatican State from 2009 to 2011. He is now in hiding after he revealed two big scandals. He revealed financial corruption within the Vatican, and he accused Pope Francis of covering up the sexual abuse that Francis's close confidant, Cardinal Theodore McCarrick, had done as Cardinal of Washington, D.C. Following these revelations, Vigano went into hiding, and since then he has joined the traditionalist camp and has become increasingly radical. There are now rumors that he has been conditionally reconsecrated as a bishop into the old rite because he was consecrated in the post-Vatican II ordination rite. And now he has been consecrated, according to rumors, by Bishop Williamson in the pre-Vatican II, pre-1968 rite. And according to Bishop Sanborn theorizes that Archbishop Vigano, take this with a grain of salt, is also a SETI privationist. So Archbishop Vigano, living in hiding, revealed a lot of scandals, which came true. A very interesting figure in the church. Next up we have 1 Peter 5. 1 Peter 5 is a kind of like a Catholic news site, a traditional Catholic news site. And historically, I haven't read their articles that much recently. Historically, they're kind of similar to LifeSite News. They're kind of like fear mongers or a fear porn site, which would say that at any point in time, the Catholic Church is right about to defect, it's right about to fall apart, everything is collapsing. And it would kind of invoke a lot of fear. It was definitely what you could call a black-pilling website. Part of that had to do with its former leader, Steve Skozjak. I probably mispronounced his name. I think it's Skojak, maybe. he apostatized from Catholicism. And so prior to that, he kept posting more and more negative things about the Catholic Church and how it's run. And now he's apostatized and openly anti-Catholic. And so I think that kind of influenced 1 Peter 5. Since he's left, my understanding is it's improved. Next up, Pope-splaining. Pope-splaining is apologetics done by Catholics, apologists or theologians, where they try to explain away any controversies that Pope Francis has done within his pontificate. To a lesser extent, this existed within Benedict XVI or John Paul II or Paul VI. But the controversies that occurred under those papacies probably could have all occurred within a year and then of a single year of Francis's papacy and been overshadowed. So it really has to do at this point with Pope Francis. And so Pope-splaining is kind of like this idea of the hermeneutic of continuity, which we talked about earlier, applied before and after Francis's papacy and trying to minimize the damage and the incoherency of Francis's teachings and his various controversies. As Francis undermines the Catholic faith, a lot of Pope-splaining is seen as kind of grasping at straws and is uncredible by a lot of the people that see it, including Orthodox Catholics. And that concludes the third tier of the traditional Catholic iceberg. Now that we're getting further along, it's time to get to the fourth tier of the iceberg. And this is where we kind of get into a lot more controversial parts of traditional Catholicism. First off, we have the Society of St. Pius X. The Society of St. Pius X is the largest order of priests in the world which practices the Latin Mass exclusively, thus the largest traditionalist group, or I should say group of traditionalist priests in the world. It's very controversial because in 1988, Archbishop Lefebvre and the 4 bishops he consecrated at that time were excommunicated. And it actually hadn't been in full communion, or I should say regularly incarnated in the church since 1976. During Benedict XVI's reign, there was kind of both sides, the Vatican and the Society of St. Pius X, are trying to get into full communion, but that hasn't happened yet. There's a lot of controversies which surround the Society of St. Pius X, and many of the various other traditionalist Catholic orders throughout the world point back towards the Society of St. Pius X as where they came from. Next up, we have the Roman Catechism. The Roman Catechism, or the Catechism of the Council of Trent. This is a compendium of Catholic doctrine which was published or commissioned after the Council of Trent, is kind of an answer to all the Reformation catechisms, most famously published by Martin Luther, to defend the Catholic faith, teach it to the faithful, and most importantly, teach it to priests. It's a pretty high-level catechism that a lot of people point to. It is usually seen as the best Catholic catechism. Michael Davies. Michael Davies was a traditionalist Catholic author that was pretty popular after the council. He was, of course, English. He wrote several books in defense of Archbishop Lefebvre. He was a leader of Una Voice, and he wrote a lot of books criticizing the Novus Ordo liturgy and the changes. He would compare the changes in the Novus Ordo liturgy following Vatican II often to the changes that occurred within the English Church during the English Reformation and the transition from English Catholicism to English Anglicanism under Cranmer. Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre. Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre was a French archbishop who passed away in 1991. He was probably the most famous and influential person throughout the entire history of the traditional Catholic movement. He was the founder and first superior general of the Society of St. Pius X. He ordained numerous priests in that order and consecrated 4 bishops, earning excommunication in 1988. Before that, he had a pretty colorful and distinguished career as a missionary, archbishop. He was actually a council father during Vatican II, and he was the leader and superior general of the Holy Ghost Fathers for a period. Archbishop Lefebvre was known for a high level of personal piety, but ultimately, as I said before, he would end up being excommunicated following the very controversial consecrations of bishops in 1988. And he was excommunicated by John Paul II then. There's a great deal of information about Archbishop Lefebvre, and the thing about it is, I'm going to end up talking about him, if I already haven't, numerous times throughout this iceberg. Fisheaters.com. Fisheaters.com is a Catholic website in the traditionalist bent, which offers a lot of resources and commentary upon the church and everyday life from a traditional Catholic perspective. It used to, I don't know if it still does, have forums, and there was a lot of shenanigans that occurred on those forums. The post-Vatican II annulment crisis. So, as I said before, the Catholic Church does not recognize civil divorce. It does not believe in divorce because, as our Lord said, marriage is permanent between a wife and her husband. And so, any kind of divorce where somebody tries to marry another person ends up becoming adultery. So the Catholic Church does not recognize divorces within itself or without itself from civil authorities. But it does recognize what it would believe to be marriage that never actually took place or never were properly able to be formed. And so that recognition that the marriage never indeed took place, that would be an annulment. And before Vatican II, annulments were really rare. You had to have an annulment lawyer, and it would take years. Usually annulments were due to some obscure technicality, and there would be only a few dozen that would occur in any year because it was so rare. Now, after Vatican II, there have been tens of thousands of annulments within the United States alone and throughout the entire Catholic world, and it's believed that the annulments right now are just kind of a rubber stamp, and indeed, to get an annulment, you have to pay, and so a lot of dioceses see annulments as kind of a way to generate revenue for themselves. While the actual technicalities which would have enabled a marriage to be annulled in the past have now been watered down to the point that it's basically just divorce. The Remnant. The Remnant is a traditionalist Catholic newspaper published in the United States out of Minnesota, in particular Forest Lake, Minnesota. It's currently run by Michael Matt, and his father, Walter Matt, founded it. It's been historically pretty sympathetic to Archbishop Lefebvre and the Society of St. Pius X. It's been ongoing since 1967, 1968. So this is what it says on Wikipedia. The Remnant claims to adhere to Catholic teaching in every aspect of its journalism. The name The Remnant is a reference to the remnant of Isaiah and to refer to not only a remnant of Catholics holding out to the traditional teachings and practice of the Church that remain after the sweeping changes brought by the Second Vatican Council. Ironically, The Remnant broke off of The Wanderer, and so The Wanderer was never, say, liberal or anything. It's also a Catholic newspaper that came out of Minnesota and actually went back into the 19th century in the 1860s. Both The Wanderer and The Remnant are run by the Matt family, but ironically, The Remnant broke off because it was a traditionalist, while The Wanderer was what you could call small O Orthodox, but adhered to the teachings of John Paul II and Paul VI, and was generally, air quotes, a conservative Catholic newspaper. Since then, the two sides of the family have reconciled, and basically both of them are traditionalist Catholic newspapers at this point. Modernist heresy. The modernist heresy is something that came up in the late 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century under the pontificates of Leo XIII and Pius X. Modernism, according to Pius X, was called the synthesis of all heresies. It's extremely difficult to define what modernism is. It's pretty notorious in how amorphous it can be. I guess if you're... A lot of people would say they would identify it with liberalism, and I know that he's not the most popular person to Catholics, and especially traditional Catholics, but I think he's a pretty good YouTuber within Christianity in general. Redeemed Zoomer, who is a Presbyterian, likes to say that Christian liberalism is the idea of taking the religion of Christianity or whatever denomination of Christianity and its claims less seriously. I think that to a certain extent fits in with what modernism is, but modernism really is the idea that truth changes over time and that truth needs to adhere to what the consensus of the modern culture at any given moment. And so a lot of the times somebody who's modernist would be kind of Machiavellian in that, say when they're 20 they could believe in one thing, when they're 40 they could believe in something else, and when they're 60 they could believe in something else, and that they believe that truth changed over time, or they're kind of just going wherever the wind blows to a certain extent. This is how the Catholic Encyclopedia tries to define it. In general, we may say that modernism aims at the radical transformation of human thought in relation to God, man, the world, and life, here and thereafter, which was prepared by humanism and the 18th century philosophy and solemnly promulgated at the French Revolution. Modernism kind of has to do with the interior predisposition of a liberal Christian, in that they still feel a religious drive as they undermine the claims of their religion, and to them what religion is kind of the good feelies of the religion. It's not so much the truth that is revealed by God through that religion, it's just sort of the efficacious feelings that religion gives them. So to them, if Christianity, if Catholicism and different branches of Christianity are right or wrong, or if Islam or Judaism or Hinduism or Buddhism or whatever faith, world religion, or even just made up junk like occultism, like astrology or something, whatever it is, as long as it creates this efficacious feeling deep down that makes somebody feel connected to the world, feel connected to some kind of higher power, that at its core is religion. And as you could see, this kind of melts religion down into this gooey garbage that can't stand up and defend itself, protect itself, and say it stands for everything. And it just kind of becomes this parody for atheists to make fun of, and it just kind of gets laughed at, and it crumbles into dust, as we'll see within the liberal Protestant churches, which have been conquered by modernism. If you point to something like the Episcopalian Church of the United States, absolutely decimated and destroyed, or the Congregationalist Church, the so-called United Church of Christ in the United States and Canada, conquered and destroyed by modernism. And so if you look there, you'll have clergy that don't even believe in the existence of God, or that Jesus was a historical person. It's basically just liberalism wearing religion as like a skin mask, like Hannibal Lecter. A good example of a modernist Catholic would be Father Richard Rohr. And so, like, a modernist canard would be radical revision, radical historical criticism of the New Testament that basically says that Christianity evolved over the course of 200 or 300 years, that the earliest Christians didn't even believe that Christ was the incarnation of the Jewish God, Yahweh, but then would push back, even though what they just said completely debunks Christianity if it were true, and just says, well, the message of Christianity basically it amounts to being a good person, and that makes me feel good. A lot of traditionalists try to point towards the Second Vatican Council and the theologians that came in its wake, and the popes even, and say that they are modernist and that they are undermining the church. But modernism, I think, is a lot more pernicious, difficult to tie down, and it doesn't like to say what it outright believes. It's just this amorphous mass which says that at the end of the day, religion is just a feeling of good feelings. The 2013 conclave's irregularity. So this has to do with the election of Pope Francis. Because the papal conclaves have several protections within them that try and make them secretive, and the actual conduct within a conclave in terms of who votes for who is supporting who, and so on, is highly secret. It's difficult to tell what will go on within any conclave that elects the Pope. But within 2013, and because of all the controversies that came out after Francis, there's kind of this whirlwind of conspiracies that surround it. And so a lot of people who are opponents of Pope Francis or believe that he's leading the church into grievous and uncharted waters, they try to persist that there was a lot of irregularities that happened within the conclave. This includes plans prior going into the conclave of various liberal clerics to try and elect Pope Francis, and kind of Pope Francis like being this Machiavellian who just flips back and forth between kind of like a middle of the road John Paul II person to being like a radical liberal or even modernist who's going to destroy the church for his own power, and like ideas that the United States secret CIA or the NSA were bugging it and trying to push away another pope that would be like Benedict XVI to John Paul II to kind of push its liberal plan on the world by overriding the Catholic Church as an opponent. Just a lot of conspiracies surrounding it, and the idea that there was a lot of breaking of rules for conclaves for the benefit of Pope Francis. This is also connected to the idea that Benedict XVI never actually withdrew or resigned from the papacy, and that he was kind of under some kind of house arrest, and he maintained the papacy throughout his life, and Pope Francis was some kind of anti-pope. And I'm going to end up talking about this several times throughout this iceberg. It's just this ongoing conspiracy, which as Francis's scandals get worse and worse, becomes a bigger and bigger conspiracy. Okay, this one's in quotations, Novus Ordo Church. So you have the Novus Ordo Mass, and so when you get into the more radical traditionalist circles, they'll often call the mainstream Catholic Church the Novus Ordo Church to try and differentiate it from what they see being true Catholics or true Catholicism, and the church that came up after Vatican II in their minds being some type of apostate church, or in the very least corrupted by modernism or liberalism, so they call it the Novus Ordo Church. Next up, we have Anthony Stein, who is a commentator, I guess kind of like an online news person for Catholicism. He has a pretty big YouTube channel and online presence in Return to Tradition. He kind of reminds me of LifeSite News or 1 Peter 5, in that he covers a lot of stuff and you'll get blackpilled from him. But I don't really think that he's as much yellow journalism. He's much straighter in what he's saying. The problem is, of course, if you follow day to day what's going on in the Curia and with Pope Francis, it becomes very depressing. Next up, we have Medjugorje is a scam. So, of course, we talked about Our Lady of Medjugorje, which is this Bosnian alleged visions. There's 6, Croatian Bosnians who say that they saw Our Lady in 1981, and they're still seeing her to this day, and that they've kept seeing her on and on since when they were teenagers until the present day. The idea that Medjugorje is a scam is that Medjugorje isn't real, that it's been condemned by the local bishops, that there's nothing going on there that's supernatural, that Mary is not visiting the people, and that it's just kind of like a tourist attraction, and that the visitors are the seers, I should say, are putting on a show as a tourist attraction to prop up the town of Medjugorje in Bosnia, as there's thousands, tens of thousands of people that go there every year as a pilgrimage, and that the town kind of gains a lot of money through this, and that some elements of the Franciscan order which run the chapels around Medjugorje are in on kind of like laundering money and making money for the Franciscan order. Next up, we have Freemason conspiracy theories. Freemasons are, on paper, a fraternal organization that trace their origins to the local guilds of stonemasons, that is, in medieval times. While they claim to trace their heritage to medieval craft guilds, they're not really a craft guild anymore. They're more or less a secret society which is based around occultism. Catholics are banned from becoming Freemasons because they're a secret society or semi-secret society where people that are members, men that are members, are the only ones that can know some of their secrets. Lots of conspiracy theories have surrounded around Freemasonry, coupled with the fact that cult rituals to some extent go on within the Freemasonic lodges. It's no wonder that a lot of Catholics pick up on Freemasonic conspiracy theories. There's this widespread belief within these conspiracy theories that the French Revolution and the rise of liberalism throughout the West is a byproduct of the secret societies of Freemasonry trying to undermine the monarchies of Europe. To this day, a lot of traditional Catholics believe that Freemasons continue to exist as a conspiratorial element within society, undermining order and undermining the Catholic religion. Next up, we have E. Michael Jones. E. Michael Jones, or EMJ. E. Michael Jones is a Catholic cultural commentator, self-taught autodidact historian. He actually has a doctorate, but it's in English. But most of his books have to do with history. If you read his books, it's clear that he doesn't have an editor and that he's kind of an autodidact when it comes to history. He didn't really get trained within the topic. I'm not saying that E. Michael Jones is a completely unreliable source, but you have to realize that he's not that well trained as an historian, and that he's not kind of like cross-referencing with the general work of historians that talk about the topics he talks about. E. Michael Jones is kind of well known for being anti-Jewish or holding a pretty anti-Semitic worldview, whether rightly or wrongly. One of his books is called The Jewish Revolutionary Spirit. That's probably his most famous one, but he's also wrote about the history of the sexual revolution. And he also talks about theology or God's plan throughout history in a book called The Logos Rising. E. Michael Jones, having an English background, makes him much better, I think, at journalism than at history. And so if you read a lot of his books that are more up to date as opposed to talking about things in the Middle Ages, a lot of those books are very good. E. Michael Jones, although going to the Novus Ordo Mass and being actually anti-Latin Mass, ironically, is usually seen kind of like tangential or sort of connected to Catholic traditionalism. He's written books condemning the Society of St. Pius X, but also condemning Medjugorje and Michael Voris. Kind of an interesting guy. I think that it is well worth reading a lot of his books. Definitely stuff that's occurred within his lifetime rather than medieval or books that have to do with iniquity. His books on the sexual revolution or his book on Medjugorje, I think, are pretty good. Next up, we have the Assisi prayer meeting controversy. So the Assisi prayer meeting, or Assisi 1, was an ecumenical prayer, I believe, for world peace that was conducted in October 27th, 1986, organized by Pope John Paul II. Numerous Christian leaders, of course, including John Paul II, but the heads of the Anglican Church and representatives for several Orthodox national churches and the leaders of several Orthodox national churches, along with Leaders in several world religions, including the Dalai Lama, prayed for world peace. John Paul II didn't necessarily, I think, directly pray with the false pagan religions, but prayed with the other Christian representatives there. There was a lot of shenanigans that went on around that time of things like a Buddhist idol of Buddha being placed upon an altar. This included Hindus, Buddhist, Shinto, just kind of like tribal, religious, kind of traditional religions praying for world peace alongside with Christians. It kind of is seen as the worst excess of John Paul II's ecumenism. In a lot of societies, St. Pius X circles, it's seen as kind of maybe one of the worst things that has happened since Vatican II. There's also been an Assisi II and Assisi III, which have also been conducted by Benedict XVI. These Assisi prayer meetings by Benedict XVI were not as spectacular as the one held by John Paul II, and they're kind of seen as slightly less sacrilegious than the first Assisi prayer meeting. Next up, we have Quo Primum. Quo Primum is the incipit of an apostolic constitution in the form of a papal bull issued by Pope Pius V on the 14th of July, 1570, after the end of Trent. It promulgated the Roman Missal, which made its use obligatory throughout the Latin Church of the Catholic Church, unless if there was a different Mass liturgy that had at least existed for 200 years. So this is the liturgical ordinance following Trent that kind of protects the Latin Mass and tries to clean up any liturgical abuses that were happening prior to the Reformation or the Counter-Reformation, and kind of fed into the Protestant uprising. Quo Primum, of course, was often used by a lot of traditional Catholics following Vatican II because they felt it gave them a defense to continue using the Latin Mass, or the pre-Vatican II non-Novus Ordo liturgy, you could say. And so a lot of the times they would quote this ending of Quo Primum: "No one whosoever is permitted to alter this notice of our permission, statute, ordinance, command, precept, grant, indult, declaration, will, decree, and prohibition. Should anyone dare to contravene it, let him know that he will incur the wrath of Almighty God and the blessed apostles Peter and Paul." So a lot of traditionalists would defend the continued use of the Latin Mass against the wishes of their bishop, and indeed the wishes of Paul VI or John Paul II, by using Quo Primum and saying that every Catholic priest had an eternal right granted to them by St. Pius V to continue saying the Latin Mass. Of course, you could argue that a equal can't bind an equal, that it's not infallible, that Paul VI has just as much power to legislate liturgy as St. Pius V did. But you could also argue that the Novus Ordo is the same Latin Mass, and so Paul VI isn't really doing anything wrong. At least legally speaking, the Novus Ordo is the Latin Mass, and so the Novus Ordo is actually also protected by Quo Primum. Next up, we have, quote, Vatican II Church. Again, a lot of traditionalists try to say that the regular church that practices the post-Vatican II liturgy, that is a new religion. And so Novus Ordo Church is a lot more common, just because you can just say the Novus Ordo, and it just kind of rings, and because it says the new order, it makes a lot more sense. But a secondary one they'll often say is the Vatican II Church. Next up, it's a sin for women to wear pants. A lot of traditionalists are for women wearing skirts or dresses all the time and oppose women wearing pants at all. Next up, we have "The smoke of Satan has entered the sanctuary." This is a quote of Paul VI. It's a famous quote talking about the decline that started to happen in the Catholic Church following Vatican II, following the issuing of the Novus Ordo. And so a lot of traditionalists say this is some kind of crocodile tears thing that Paul VI said about the decline, or how he was pumping the smoke into the sanctuary. Some people point to it as Paul VI having some kind of cold feet or regret for promulgating the new Mass or promulgating Vatican II and the decline that happened thereafter. I mean, you could also read it pretty straight on that Paul VI was a small or Orthodox Catholic, and that he was fairly conservative and fairly loyal, and that he saw the decline in faithfulness as a terrible thing, and that in his mind it wasn't necessarily connected to the promulgation of the Novus Ordo. Next up we have Leo XIII's vision. So, what year was this? This was October 13th, 1884. Pope Leo XIII had a vision in the private chapel in the Vatican where he saw Satan and Jesus saying that there would be a wager for the Catholic Church, Satan claiming that he could destroy the Catholic Church, and Christ saying, go ahead and try, you can't do it. And basically the devil was said to be given 75 to 100 years to destroy the Catholic Church. And of course, 75 years later, in 1959, John the 23rd publicly summoned the Second Vatican Council, and the Second Vatican Council was on its way. And also, interestingly, 1984, 100 years later, and I'm going to butcher the Latin here, Quator Habnec Annos was released by John Paul II, and this is the indult, which kind of allows the Latin Mass to be done again after Paul VI basically banned the Latin Mass. So it's kind of interesting is that you could point towards those years, but you could also do it as kind of like it's a Texas sharpshooter fallacy. Anyway, following this vision, Leo XIII would, of course, write out the St. Michael prayer and promulgate it to the church and say that it needs to be prayed a lot. Next up we have Icone in 1988. So this is a reference to the Icone consecrations. This is on the 30th of June 1988, where Archbishop Lefebvre and Bishop Castro de Meyer consecrate 4 new bishops for the Society of St. Pius X. And John Paul II excommunicates them. Archbishop Lefebvre had been in communication with the Vatican for years, trying to get a new bishop to continue doing the Latin Mass, to continue ordaining priests for the Society of St. Pius X, so that the Latin Mass would not die out. And eventually, Archbishop Lefebvre said, they're waiting for me to die. And he went along with the consecrations anyway, and he was excommunicated. Those 4 bishops being Bishop Garalata, Bishop Feli, Bishop Tissier de Montelaires. I'm going to mispronounce all their names, and of course, the one I'm not going to mispronounce, Bishop Williamson. I can read a lot better than I can pronounce, and a lot of the times when I talk for a while, my nose and sinuses get kind of stuffed up, and it makes it a lot more difficult for me to pronounce a lot of words. Next up we have Rorcelli. Rorcelli is a pretty popular traditionalist Catholic blog. It's pretty scholarly. I suggest that you read it, at least sometimes. Very good. Next up we have Pink Seminaries, Pink Mafia, Lavender Mafia, Gay Seminaries. This is the idea that, at least within the English Catholic Church and other churches within the Western world, that there's this huge underground of gay Catholic priests, and that a lot of seminarians are turned away because the heads of the seminaries or priests that are already there that are gay are turning away straight men and are choosing selectively gay men. This is talked about, I think, most famously within the book No More Good Men. And the idea is that it's gotten to such an extent that there's so many gay priests, or that they basically are a lobby group within the Vatican, and that a lot of the liberal policies that are passed are done by this lobby group of gay priests, gay bishops, and finally gay cardinals, as seen as Cardinal McCarrick, and arguably Cardinal Ferdinand within Chicago. Next up we have Taylor Marshall. Taylor Marshall is an interesting figure. He originally was an Anglican, converted to Catholicism, and now he's a traditional Catholic firebrand. He wrote the book Infiltration, which we'll get to later down in this iceberg. he kind of says that there's a lot of like Freemasons and communists and like people working for intelligence agencies that were pushing the watering down of Catholic doctrine, that led to Vatican II and led to the decline of faithfulness within the church. He actually has a degree in philosophy. He originally was an Anglican priest, but he didn't become a Catholic priest, which I believe he would be able to, because I've known several Anglican priests, at least within the 2000s, that converted around the time that he did, which were allowed to maintain their families. But he has a doctorate in philosophy, and he got it at the University of Dallas. He has a pretty big YouTube presence. It's kind of, a lot of people will be like, why did you put him down so low? Well, the reasoning is that I set up this iceberg not necessarily in how famous somebody is, but in more of where I think they fit into the deeper and deeper levels, both in terms of kind of deeper thought done by traditionalists, but also kind of more extreme that traditionalist views are. Next up, we have a fraternal correction. This is the idea that bishops are able to correct the Pope if he's wrong or he's erring on doctrine. Next up, we have Vatican II was a pastoral council, not a dogmatic council, and it's in quotes. This was a pretty common thing at the beginning of traditionalism. I don't know if it's that common anymore, because if you read Vatican II, it doesn't really hold up. And that there are numerous councils that were called not necessarily to condemn heresies, but were just called in the Middle Ages to kind of organize the church, or help the church organize, or just kind of like seeing where the church is and then sending the bishops out like Vatican II did. Vatican II didn't really condemn that many heresies, but it reiterated Catholic doctrine. And so it wasn't simply a pastoral council. There are dogmatic degrees within Vatican II. But back in the day, this is something a lot of traditionalists would say, to kind of say that Vatican II wasn't even a council. And we're going to get to that later. But it's just something that you used to hear. I don't think you hear it that much anymore. Next up, we have Pope Francis is unpopular with the Curia. This is the idea that Pope Francis is this dictator pope, that neither liberals nor small old Orthodox Catholics across the board really like him. And because he rules in an arbitrary and dictatorial fashion, which is not in continuity with how the post-Vatican II popes controlled the church, or before that, a lot of people in the Curia and a lot of cardinals personally dislike him, and that he kind of puts everybody on edge, and everybody's walking on their tippy toes around him not to upset him. And so the idea that comes from this is that generally most of the bishops and archbishops and cardinals throughout the Catholic Church have a disgust for Pope Francis, even if they agree with his liberal or quasi-liberal or opening the doors to liberal interpretation policies. They just generally don't like him. A lot of them are scared of him, and that the next pope that's elected is not going to be Francis, and it's not going to be one of Francis's yes men. Okay, we have the third secret was never released. I feel like I covered this earlier in the third tier about the third secret of Fatima controversy. So the third secret was never released is a pretty popular version of the conspiracy. There's other more extreme or fringe ones, but this, I think, is the most popular one within traditional Catholicism, is that the third secret that has been released is either censored or it's an outright forgery, and the actual third secret has never been released. Next up, we have monarchism. Monarchism is of course, the political philosophy which advocates monarchism, or the rule of one, the rule of a king or an emperor. Many Catholics historically would have been monarchists. Today, obviously, monarchy has declined throughout the world. A minority of governments throughout the world continue to be monarchist, and a lot of the monarchies that remain, say in Spain or in Great Britain or in the Low Countries or in Scandinavia, in Europe at least, they hold no real power. A lot of them do continue to be very popular with the people, and in fact, even when the monarchies are overthrown throughout the world, they remain popular with the people throughout that entire time, even after they were overthrown. And there are a lot of restorationist societies that want to try and establish monarchies again in their country, but somebody who is a monarchist doesn't necessarily defend a monarchy simply because it's pretty or it's a traditional thing to do. They actively do believe that a monarchy is the best form of government, that republicanism is basically doomed to always become an oligarchy ruled by money powers, and a monarchy is not going to be ruled by money powers. Of course, the monarch may be rich himself, but usually as a person who is a member of a family, he has much more commitment to his country because he views himself as the representative for the country, as the embodiment of the country. So he's much less likely to make short-term decisions for financial gain, and he views the continued prosperity of his country, the continued stability of his country, as not just important for himself, but important for his family and important for his religion. It's kind of known, of course there's been republics, that's the other form of government. There's really two forms of governments and then just kind of little tweaks off of them, monarchism and republicanism. But it's really well known that the more traditional, the more religious a society is, the more monarchist it will be. And the more secular society it will be, the more likely it is to be a republic. Because the monarch and his family are directly connected and they rule over a long period rather than in-turn rulers switching about between different factions or parties, that one monarchist tries to unify the people behind him. He's much more popular than any Republican leaders almost always are. Only in sometimes totalitarian dictatorships you'll see a ruler who is as popular as a monarch in republics. But generally, a monarch is very popular. He tries to help out each member or each group within his society. And it's kind of like a landowner. A monarchy maintains the country for the greater goal of that country because he is basically a landowner, while a leader within a republic is a renter. Because that leader within the republic, he only has the office with a limited part of time, and eventually he's going to be pushed out by the opposing faction, and so his benefits are not to the country as a whole, but to simply his faction. In Europe, traditionally, a lot of monarchies would give a lot of support to the church, and the church would support the monarchies. As the monarchies were overthrown, although there may have been a few generational legs, we've seen the decline of Catholicism and Christianity in general throughout Europe, mirrored with the decline of the monarchies. Next up, we have Father James Altman. Father James Altman is a pretty controversial priest out in 2020 when he criticized a lot of restrictions put upon offering the Mass following COVID-19, and he was pretty critical of the Democratic Party in the United States and said that no Catholic could really be a Democrat because most Democrats support abortion. Eventually he would be kind of kicked out of his diocese, and he's not really excommunicated, but he's not allowed to celebrate Mass publicly. He's kind of was seen as this rebel priest, and he became a lot popular with kind of people on the border of, I guess you could say, conservative Novus Ordo and traditionalism. He's kind of moved towards sedevacantism or benevacantism right now. And he's made friends with Bishop Strickland, who got kicked out of his diocese by Pope Francis. So just a pretty controversial figure. He had kind of like a quasi-sedevacantist rant, which became pretty viral recently. He's somebody that we should watch for and see if he ends up getting excommunicated or see if he gets reordained as a sedevacantist, or what ends up happening with him. He's definitely somebody to keep your eye on and definitely an interesting figure. Next up, we have apparition chasers. Apparition chasers are people that have a deep piety based around Mary, and they tend to really like apparitions of the Virgin Mary. And there's, of course, many viable famous ones that have been confirmed by the church, like Our Lady of La Salette, Our Lady of Lourdes, Our Lady of Knock, Our Lady of Fatima, and so on. But these people tend to chase after open, supposed visitations of the Virgin Mary, which either have not yet been recognized by the church or even outright rejected by the church. And so you have these people that kind of span the earth trying to see apparitions or meet with seers, and that there's kind of this whole underground culture within the Catholic Church, and this by no means is limited towards the traditionalist movement. In fact, I think there's more people outside of the traditionalist movement than within it that are apparition chasers. Apparition chasers, of course, are usually connected to apparitions which are not that viable, we'll say. So you have Our Lady of Medjugorje, Our Lady of Naju, Our Lady of Bayside, the Bayside Visions, and so on. I'm not saying that the Virgin Mary is not appearing to anybody, or that you shouldn't necessarily do a pilgrimage to any modern visitations, but I think that you should be cautious and that you should try and follow what the local bishop is saying as the final authority on if that apparition really is taking place, because this culture that's risen in the church is leading to the birth of a lot of cults, and these cults we'll talk about further on, deeper down in this iceberg the further we go. Next up we have Blessed Anne Emmerich, and I believe this is the first time that we see one of my numerous typos. Sorry, I'm kind of a idiot. But when I copied and pasted it off my list of the various things I was going to put on this iceberg, I guess her H got cut off. She was she was German. So she was a German bedbound nun who had several visions and wrote a lot of, I guess you could say, Catholic mysticism. She's really popular within traditionalist circles in general. She's just kind of this really popular writer. I have not read any of her writings myself. She's said to have had the stigmata. John Paul II made her a blessed in 2004. Really popular figure. A lot of traditionalists, both within the church and Sedevacantist or even schismatic, kind of like conclavist groups, really look to her. And she kind of ends up becoming, in a lot of this literature, extremely important in their piety, in their theology, and just pretty influential generally over a lot of traditionalist Catholic mysticism. Next up we have Bishop Antonio de Castro de Meyer. He was a Brazilian bishop that resisted the changes that came into the church following the Second Vatican Council until he was forced to resign because Paul VI had mandatory ages that bishops had to resign that he placed into being. So he continued to have his whole diocese have the Latin Mass and continue to use the pre-Vatican II sacraments until 1981 when he was forced to resign by Paul VI. But actually he kind of set up his own parallel diocese there in Campos, and Campos to this day has a parallel diocese, which is this very weird setup known as the Personal Apostolic Administration of St. John Mary Vianney. And so when the bishop, the deceased Bishop Meyer, continued on, he actually reconciled with the church in 2002. And so Campos kind of has this parallel traditional Catholic diocese within itself. And it's a very odd setup. It's called like the Personal Apostolic Administration. It's the only one that's in existence. But it's canonically regular within the Catholic Church. And it exclusively does, pre-Vatican II rites. Its current bishop is Fernando Arias Rafan. I don't speak Portuguese. I'm sorry. I'm sure I butchered his name. But he's the current bishop of this parallel diocese, which descends from Bishop Meyer creating his parallel diocese in Campos, Brazil. Bishop Mayer was staunchly anti-communist, and as I said before, he was at the Icone consecrations, and he ended up co-consecrating the 4 bishops with Archbishop Lefebvre and was excommunicated. Next up we have Galatians 2:11 through 14. This is a quote of St. Paul's, which is used by a lot of Protestants to try and argue that Peter wasn't the head of the church initially, and that the apostles kind of had like a horizontal authority with one another. But it kind of ends up being a way to defend the whole recognize and resist crowd, kind of defend them scripturally, a way to point towards that kind of viewpoint of the papacy or the idea of a fraternal correction. So I have the Douay-Rheims quote of it up. But when Cephas came to Antioch, I withstood him to the face because he was to be blamed. For before that some came from James, he did eat with the Gentiles, but when they were come, he withdrew and separated himself, fearing them that were of the circumcision. And to his dissimulation, the rest of the Jews consented, so that Barabbas was led by them to that dissimulation. But when I saw that they walked not uprightly unto the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas before them all, if thou, being a Jew, livest after the manner of the Gentiles, and not as the Jews do, how dost thou compel the Gentiles to live as do the Jews? In case you didn't know, Cephas is another name for St. Peter. So in this quote of the Bible, Paul is confronting St. Peter to his face and telling him he's a hypocrite for eating separately from Gentiles, because the new law or the new covenant instituted by God after Christ reigning on the earth gets rid of that distinction, gets rid of the necessity for the law, and that Christianity, the true religion of God, is open to the Gentiles as it was open to the Jews before, and that there's no need to, say, separate eating between Jews and Gentiles anymore. Now we have another typo I made, refuse and resist, which is a Sepultura song, but it's actually supposed to be recognize and resist, and recognize and resist is kind of the viewpoint of the Society of St. Pius X, and as Pope Francis's papacy has gone on, the viewpoint of Bishop Strickland or Bishop Athanasius Schneider. It's the viewpoint that Pope Francis is the Pope, but when he does something wrong that is contrary to what ought to be done or to the Catholic faith, that the faithful have an obligation to continue to recognize him as the Pope, but resist bad orders or bad judgments that Pope may make. Ironically, I think recognize and resist was initially kind of like sedevacantist name-calling or slander to the Society of St. Pius X. But ironically, the Society and a lot of other traditionalist Catholics now use the term to defend their own position. Next up, we have Our Lady of Akita. Our Lady of Akita is the title of the Blessed Mother of God associated with Marian apparitions. In 1973, seen by Sister Agnes Kasato Sakajawa, I've mispronounced her Japanese name, I'm sure, which was in a remote area on the outskirts of Akita, Japan. The message emphasizes prayer, of course, like all valid Marian apparitions, and penance, in combination with some cryptic prophecies which are supposed to be very similar to the real Third Secret of Fatima, or at least the released Third Secret of Fatima, and warning about bishops opposing bishops and cardinals opposing cardinals, and a general decline of the Catholic Church. This was pretty famous because Japan is not exactly a Catholic majority country. Catholics have, of course, probably endured the most severe persecution in the history of the church within Japan, which we'll talk about later. And the country is Shinto and Buddhist, but this is kind of famous because in December of 1973, a miracle associated with the vision, the statue of Mary crying, was shown publicly on Japanese television. This is a valid apparition which has been approved by the local diocese, and which Benedict XVI has commented on and said was real. So she talks about cardinals opposing cardinals, as I said before, and kind of a general division between the church. I believe I have the quote here. "My dear daughter, listen well to what I have said to you. As I told you, if men do not repent and better themselves, the Father will inflict a terrible punishment on all of humanity, the good as well as the bad, sparing neither priest nor faithful. The survivors will find themselves so desolate that they will envy the dead. Each day recite the prayer of the Rosary. With the Rosary, pray for the Pope, the bishops, and the priests. The work of the devil will infiltrate into the church in such a way that one will see cardinals opposing cardinals and bishops against other bishops. The priests who venerate me will be scorned and opposed by their confreres. The church and the altars will be sacked. The church will be full of those who accept compromises, and the demon will press many priests and consecrated souls to leave the service of the Lord. The demon will be especially implacable against the souls consecrated to God. The thought of the loss of so many souls is the cause of my sadness. If sins increase in number and gravity, there will be no longer pardon for them. With courage, speak to your superior. It is Bishop Ido who directs your community. You have still something to ask. Today is the last time that I'll speak to you in a living voice. From now on, you will obey the one sent to you and your superior. I am alone, am able still to save you from the calamities which will approach." So, pretty aggressive, pretty weighty stuff. Bishops opposing bishops, cardinals opposing cardinals, division within the church, a decline in piety of the church, numerous souls damned, and that Mary's the only one that's holding back the wrath of God from basically destroying the earth and leaving the living to envy the dead. Pretty weighty stuff, and it has been approved by the Catholic Church. Finally, we have limbo of the infants. And so limbo of the infants is this kind of hypothetical idea that the unbaptized who are not guilty of actual sin, so babies, toddlers, young children before the age of reason, before they become culpable of their actions, that they cannot be saved, and so that they will end up in a limbo, which is part of hell, but they will not be punished there. They will spend the rest of eternity within an earthly paradise. So this is not necessarily confirmed by the church, but it's one of the solutions, and probably the most common solution to the problem of unbaptized who are not guilty of any sins outside of original sin, and who have not been baptized and so cannot enter heaven. And so it's held by a lot of doctors of the church, St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Augustine, and St. Alphonsus Liguori. Of course, a lot of people in the modern world don't like this idea. They don't like the idea that babies or toddlers or very young children would end up going to hell through no fault of their own, even if it's not a hell of punishment. And so a lot of people want to try and make it so that these babies would somehow be saved in some type of way. So that concludes part 2 and tier 4 of the traditional Catholic iceberg. This is turning out to be a lot of work, and I'm sorry that I have such terrible mispronunciation and I stutter. I'm not the best speaker, and I'm not going off of a script per se. It's more I'm using the outline of the iceberg I made myself and kind of just talking a little bit about each topic as I go on. Hopefully you guys are enjoying it, and I expect comments to say where I'm wrong, and I expect comments to say what I left out, and those are welcome, because this iceberg's not perfect, and obviously I'm not perfect. Please pray for me and pray for the church. Thank you.